Imagine 4 students taking the exact same exam. Now, one of them stays calm, the other one panics, one has been prepping for years, and the other one finishes it so incredibly fast but makes a bunch of mistakes. This perfectly simulates the oil crisis perpetrated by the conflict between Israel and Iran in the Middle East. The 4 students that I'm talking about in Southeast Asia are Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines, because different countries have different approaches to handle the situation. Now the big question is, what can Indonesia take from all of these 4 nations together and integrate into our system for a better long-term planning? Hi, my name is Karan. Welcome to my podcast, Youth Uncensored. Now, the first student would be a student who didn't prep that much until the night before the exam. That student would most likely be the Philippines. For context, before this crisis hit, Philippines imported roughly 98% of its oil. 98%. So they produced only 2% of their oil, meaning that almost all of their oil is imported, which is insane. To think that if 98% of that oil is gone, then they only have 2% of oil left for the entire nation. And Philippines is not a small nation. Because of this, they declared a national emergency within 24 hours. The International Energy Agency recommends that each nation should have at least 90 days worth of energy reserves in case of an emergency. But guess what? Philippines had half of that. They had 45 days worth of emergency energy reserves. The government did try to put up some solutions there, but they were like iffy. One of them being that they released a 20 million peso emergency fund. They tried looking for alternative oil options, and even they tried to import oil from Russia through a sanctions waiver. And finally, they tried to also suspend fuel taxes. These indeed weren't long-term solutions, and therefore if this crisis were to last longer, then I guess they're cooked. Now, if we look at a couple quotes from their president themselves, President Marcos Jr., he said that the Philippines has enough oil until June. Seems familiar to what Bahlil said about us being stable, right? Now, they still had a lot of reserves, which, I think that part of his statement was true, but he didn't account for several other factors, such as constant inflation. As he was talking about having oil, inflation, prices were going up, and also transportation strikes occurred and their emergency funds were released. So there are some things that are true, and there are these factors that kind of challenge his credibility of his statement. Now, ultimately, the lesson for Indonesia that we might be able to take away from the situation in the Philippines is that the crisis at hand doesn't stop when you already have fuel, but it stops when people stop realizing that, they're in a disaster. Because once people realize that they're in a shortage, they're in a crisis, they're gonna start, disaster is gonna just keep on going up. Prices are gonna keep on going up because there's higher demand. Now, other than the Philippines, another ASEAN nation that we could learn a thing or two is, based on my analogy, is a kid who already had their notes prepared before the exam. And that kid is no other than Malaysia. Now, why was Malaysia so calm in the first place? I mean, that is a fair question. Malaysia is indeed a large producer of oil, but now in the big 2026, you could say they have become a net importer now, with 40% of their crude oil passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this therefore means that Malaysia is not immune. So why didn't Malaysia panic like other countries, like let's say Philippines or Indonesia? Well, that's because they relied on Petronas. Now, Petronas publicly reassured that they still had a sufficient oil supply, and therefore they just said, we got this covered. So Malaysia was handling this pretty better than anyone else. And by Malaysia, I mean Petronas. So why the hell could Petronas, out of every single oil company in Southeast Asia, why could Petronas do that? Well, that's because they simply diversified their oil supply, their oil sources, years before this crisis ever even happened. They didn't just rely on the Middle East. They went to Latin America, they went to Africa, they went to the Americas, and in fact, 22% of oil they imported was from outside the Middle East, showing how effectively they diversified their sources so that they're not dependent on one singular source. Say we have student A, student B. Student A has one teammate while student B has 5 teammates. Now, if each of them have one teammate disappear, obviously student A has 0 teammates left and student B has 4 teammates left. Which one has a bigger problem? I think that's pretty obvious, it's student A. Now, that correlates to how source diversification works in terms of oil supplies and imports for oil in real life. Because if your one source, your only source, disappears because a strait got closed, well then you're cooked. In comparison to, let's say, Malaysia, whose Petronas diversified their sources from Latin America, from the Americas, from Africa, way farther away from the Middle East. That means they still can have some imports of oil and oil supply even though the Middle East is cut off. So I think the biggest takeaway from that whole discussion was that, you don't have to become Petronas to be successful. If we just gave Pertamina enough flexibility, less social, less political pressure, I think that Pertamina can be self-sustaining. It could have, the same resources, the same amount of source diversification Petronas has had. And that will benefit us in the long run because we're not just going to be dependent on only one source. But the bigger question that we have to ask is how we can give Pertamina this flexibility despite many political pressures in Indonesia. Other than Malaysia, I think there are other ways you can handle this, as evident in a country like Vietnam. Now, other than being extremely diversified with its oil supply and oil sources, they went from nothing in their wind and solar power to 21,000 megawatts. How insane is that? Now, how did Vietnam become one of the fastest expanding energy developing countries in ASEAN? Now, they did this because they provided feed-in tariffs for investors. And this basically means that if you guys, as in you guys are investors, if I tell the investors that to make renewable projects in Vietnam, then I'll give them long-term prices. And investors just love that. And that's why billions of dollars just came pouring in after that was established. And after that, solar panels, solar farms, they just appeared everywhere, as well as wind farms as well. In fact, renewable energy makes up 13% of Vietnam's entire electricity. And that is really impressive because they did this by 2024. But the main problem here is that they built these solar farms, these wind farms, way too fast. They didn't even develop that much power lines yet to transport this immense amount of electricity to all parts of the nation. And because of this, there were major consequences. I mean, investors lost 40% of revenue because they were told to reduce their output, or else they'd be farming too much electricity with nowhere for the electricity to even go to. And this doesn't mean that, Vietnam's structure, this whole system is a failure. It's just that although it's a great idea investing in renewable energy projects, they didn't have enough infrastructure to transport that electricity to reach, all areas of the country. Well, on top of that, corruption is increasingly becoming a top risk factor in Vietnam right now, as there have been reports of licensing issues, permit irregularities, and even more problems associated with corruption. And this shows a pattern that if you're not prepared, if you don't have your priorities straight, then problems will keep on stacking and stacking onto each other until you find a long-term solution. Now, we'll move on to the final and the most unique example yet. I'd say this one is the most quiet one yet, but the most successful one, and that is, of course, Thailand. While Indonesia has been debating a lot over B50, Thailand has been strengthening their biofuels program. As seen in their development programs and development measures, they've been scaling from B7 to B10 to B20, so on and so forth, as it provides them an adjustable time frame for them to adjust to different programs. In Formula One, you just don't go straight into Formula One. There's different levels. You start from basic driving, then you get tested, and then after a while of learning, after you train a lot, then you get into Formula One, and then you start to drive professionally. I think the same applies to this program that the Thai modelers have built because it allows for a lot of adjustments. This time frame allows for different kinds of debugging. It really benefits the Thai economy in the long run because it isn't just an immediate rapid expansion, rapid development like Vietnam. Rather, they take the time to look at what's going well, what's going bad, and react based on that. Now, the reason why many professionals like the Thai model is because Thai people, they gradually develop their supply chains, they build quality control systems, and they introduce blended finance models that benefit the Thai economy in the long run. Now, if we move on to Indonesia's unique experience in this debate, let's take the B50 debate on how we should implement it or whether we should implement it or not. Because some supporters say that it will increase our energy independence and fuel independence, while critics say that it will cause food inflation, it will cause palm oil shortages, and both sides are indeed true, and therefore we have to question ourselves whether we should implement Thailand's upscaling kind of gradual program where they upscale from B7 to B10 to B20 and so on and so forth, so that we as a nation, we can adapt to this changing economy. So, out of all of these 4 ASEAN countries, which one has the best program? To be honest, I think that none of them really have the best one. They all have their strengths and they all have their weaknesses. But the real question now, how can Indonesia adapt and how can they integrate all these solutions into their own system? From Philippines, we have to learn that sometimes short-term emergency response solutions, although not always the best, are always effective in calming down the immediate consequence of the political issue. And Vietnam, they quickly developed renewable energy infrastructure but fell short on how to spread the energy gathered across the country. And for Malaysia, the lesson we learned was we should have diverse suppliers and diversified sources. And finally, Thailand, the lesson there is that we should upscale, gradually increase or gradually change the program in which we are implementing, such as B7, B10, B20, B50, ultimately creates more adaptability and more room for tweaking. So out of all these discussions, there are 3 takeaways that I want to bring with me in the final few minutes of my discussion. And that are 1, these crises are actually ways for us to learn, ways for our governments to spot the weaknesses that are stopping and hindering us from developing even further. And 2, it reminds us that preparation years before the crisis is very important for long-term solutions. And 3, no ASEAN country has a perfect model, but each one has at least one lesson that is worth taking. So my final question would be, since Indonesia has, the resources, the people, the labor, the ambition, and most importantly, the economic size to become ASEAN's regional economic powerhouse. So if all the potential is there, then what's actually stopping us? If you want to keep engaging in these discussions in the future, please feel free to subscribe, like, comment, and last but not least, hit that notification bell for future updates.